Welcome to today's lecture. We're going to be covering some important aspects of composition, which is a subject that can take at least 2 years to investigate and a lifetime to explore. I see compositions that startle and amaze me, and I was born in the middle of last century and have been a working photographer for over 40 years. So there's no end to the joy we can get from our continued involvement in the arts. Let's get started. A poor photo composition can make a fantastic subject dull, but a well set up scene can create a wonderful image from the most ordinary of situations. With that in mind, I've picked what I consider to be the top 10 compositional tips, or rules, if you will, to show you how to transform your images. Even the word rule isn't accurate because these are just tips for you to follow and be inspired by. Don't feel that you've got to remember every one of these tips and apply them to each photo that you take. Instead, spend a little time practicing each one in turn and they'll become second nature. You'll soon learn to spot situations where the different rules can be applied to best effect. Photo composition doesn't have to be complicated. There are all sorts of theories about composition, but the rule of thirds and the more complex golden mean are essential. If you pay too much attention to strict formulas while you're shooting, you run the risk of making your photos less spontaneous. That's why getting familiar with these basics is all you really need to do right now. With high-resolution cameras, you can always crop images in post-processing, as long as you apply some basics while you're shooting. I recommend that everyone become familiar with the concepts created by the great Italian scientist, artist, mathematician, and inventor Leonardo Fibonacci. You know, it's a shame that his name is not more well known today because he developed systems of composition that have greatly influenced Western art for over 800 years. He was born in 1170. He was the son of merchants. During his young life, he traveled throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and this brought him in contact with Arab mathematicians and artists. At the age of about 18, Fibonacci began seeing how these two disciplines can intersect. The rule of thirds, in which much of the world conforms to naturally, and the golden mean, which is an extension of the rule of thirds involving 9 squares, was a wonderful discovery. It had existed long before Fibonacci was born, but it was never articulated in the way that he managed to do it. He later created a complex series of numbers called the Fibonacci sequence that describes much of the repeating patterns that appear as beauty in nature. He did this by using mathematical terms. And oh, by the way, he was also the one that brought the Arabic numeral system to Europe. That's right. He advocated the use of the ancient simple forms we all use today, plus the introduction of the decimal point. So when you look at the concepts Fibonacci gave us, it's amazing. This guy was a genius. We'll discuss his approach in more detail in another video. In the modern world, you'll be working with a wide range of subjects and scenes, and this requires an open-minded approach. What works for one photo doesn't necessarily work for another. As hard as you may try to break the rules, you're going to find that you're just conforming to another rule. That's the fun of art. The key thing to understand is how all the decisions you make about your compositions can affect the way a shot looks and how people perceive your photos, the way you frame a shot, choose a focal length, position a person, and control your depth of field all combine to make the difference between a boring shot and a dramatic one. So let's look at 10 aspects of composition that will serve you well. Tip 1. Simplify the scene. When you look at a scene with your naked eye, your brain quickly picks out subjects of interest, but the camera doesn't discriminate. It captures everything it sees, which can lead to cluttered, messy photos with no clear focal point. What you need to do is choose your subject, then select a focal point that makes it the center of attention in the frame. But that doesn't mean that the center of attention should be placed in the center of the frame. This is important. In fact, that usually produces a boring or what we call a static image. Mr. Fibonacci warned us about doing that. Your center of attention, that is the most striking element in your composition, should be cleverly placed to elicit a desired response from the viewer. Now, this concept is easy to work with using dark silhouettes against a bright background or light objects against a dark background. Many textures and patterns with differences in light and dark also allow the photographer to arrange the elements in ways to create tension or calm. Fibonacci recommended that the focal point of a scene reside on one of the 4 intersections of the lines that create the golden mean. When 2 elements of equal value, that is, equal in tone, size, weight, occur in a photo, it makes the viewer very uneasy. We call this reaction tension. If 2 or 3 items of different value are used, the viewer feels more comfortable. In most cases, several objects that total an odd number feel better than several objects that total an even number. 3 is better than 2. 5 is more pleasing than 4. But if 2 or 4 elements must appear in the composition, try to make them different sizes and don't place them equidistant from each other. The takeaway from the rule of simplification is to eliminate busy backgrounds and use what you have to get your images down to one main element and have the others play a lesser role, a supporting role if possible. If the other elements detract from the main element too much, they should be eliminated altogether. Tip 2. Fill the frame. When you're shooting a large-scale scene, it can be hard to know how big your subject should be in the frame, or if you should get closer or farther away, or zoom into it to achieve a pleasing balance. Leaving too much space around your focal point is a common mistake. It makes your subject smaller than it needs to be, and it can also leave viewers confused about what they're supposed to be looking at. You control that with your composition. Moving closer to a subject is one way to make things more massive and important. Now, this isn't always possible when photographing large elements in nature. That's when it gets fun to zoom in and isolate the shape of the object or choose just a portion of it to show off its dramatic lines, its tonal values, or its textures. This technique is a favorite approach for architectural photographers that make dramatically simple compositions from very, very busy subjects. Another great trick is to include a small secondary subject with your massive main subject. In this powerful photo by Margaret Burke White, which appeared on the cover of the very first Life magazine in 1937, she makes a strong statement with massive forms of a giant dam, even stronger by including the workers at the bottom of the shot. See how small they are in relationship to the big forms? The lesson from this tip is to use your entire frame to create your composition. If you must include just a bit more than you need, that's okay, because that will allow for future cropping. But never shoot a photo that covers so much area that no center of interest can be readily identified. Tip 3 is aspect ratio. It's easy to get stuck in a rut and take every picture with the camera held in the same position. Cell phone pictures are always done vertically, which can be called portrait aspect, while grown-up cameras are usually in the horizontal position, which is also called landscape. When you've found an interesting subject, you should take photos in both portrait and landscape. You'll find that each aspect ratio has its advantages. The portrait aspect allows you to tip the camera up or down to easily place the horizon in the upper or the lower third, giving you more sky or a feeling of more depth. As we'll see later, the Fibonacci rule of thirds dictates that the horizon should never be in the center and always in the upper or lower third. Switching to landscape position eliminates extra sky, and it's a good choice when the sky is solid blue or boring gray. Just because the vertical position is called portrait doesn't mean we must always use it for portraits. The landscape aspect can be quite useful for portraits. In fact, many portraits of people are taken in either vertical or horizontal aspect and then cropped into a square for the final image. The main lesson here is to work with your aspect ratio by taking numerous images in both positions, so you'll have options for cropping later. Tip 4, avoid the middle of the frame. When you're first starting out, it's tempting to put whatever you're shooting right in the center of the frame. This is especially true when bad photographers take shots of family members. They put their face right in the middle of the frame, even if it's a full-length photo, cutting off the subject's lower body and showing way too much sky. That really wastes a lot of valuable real estate in your frame. The Fibonacci approach for this rule is to place your main subject on one of the 4 intersections of the 9-box guide that we call the golden mean. Once you get into the habit of this approach, you'll find that your images will look more dramatic and professional. There are reasons to break this rule, but I recommend getting good at this one before you ignore it. This approach of never putting your center of interest in the center of the frame is probably the most important of all the basic rules of composition. Tip 5, leading lines. A poorly composed photograph will leave your viewers unsure about where to look and where their attention might drift aimlessly around the scene without finding a clear focal point. To prevent this static result, you can use lines to control the way people's eyes move around the picture. Converging lines give a strong sense of perspective and three-dimensional depth, drawing you into an image. Curved lines can take you on a journey around the frame, leading you towards the main subject. The best examples using leading lines takes the viewer through the image from point A to point B, then provides us with a subordinate point C where we stop for a brief second, and then we return to point A again to repeat our journey. These compositions are very nice to look at over and over again. Grasping this concept and using it for all types of photography is going to take your photos to an entirely new level. Lines exist everywhere in the form of walls, fences, roads, trails, buildings, arms, hats, and telephone wires. They can also be implied, perhaps by the direction in which an off-center subject is looking. Why do leading lines work so well? Well, when pictures contain a strong line, it's almost impossible for your eyes not to follow it. As the posts in this image get further away, they create a converging effect that pulls you in. Always be on the lookout for elements that create leading lines. Except for a special effect or to create tension, have the elements lead somewhere besides the center of the image. Of course, having the leading lines that point to the center of the image is one way to make an image very formal. This, too, is a broken rule that has become a new rule. But most of your images should lead us to one of the 4 intersections of the golden mean, through it, and possibly out the frame or back into it. After you get that shot, do whatever else you want with the image.